On Saturday morning at 10:50 Atlantic time, the ground east of the island of Barbuda moved for 56 seconds. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake, 60 miles offshore, in a stretch of ocean almost nobody who lives outside the Caribbean has ever thought about. No buildings collapsed, no people died, no tsunami arrived. By the standards that decide what makes the American news cycle in 2026, it was nothing. The kind of event your feed scrolls past on the way to the next thing. But the address of an earthquake is sometimes more important than its magnitude. And this earthquake's address sits directly on top of a major Megathrust subduction zone that, in living historical time, killed 6,000 people in a single morning, and almost no one in North America knows it exists. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Now, let's get into it. Part 1. The magnitude 6 that nobody covered. There is a string of identifiers that almost no one outside the seismological community will ever see. A 6084. 11 characters. A letter, a string of digits, 2 more letters. It looks like a license plate from a state nobody lives in. But it is, in fact, the official designator that the United States Geological Survey assigned at 1450 hours and 6 seconds, Coordinated Universal Time on Saturday, May 16th, 2026, to an earthquake that originated approximately 70 kilometers east-southeast of the town of Codrington, on the island of Barbuda, in the Lesser Antilles. You're very unlikely to have heard about it. It happened on a Saturday morning, during a week in which American attention was elsewhere, on tornadoes forming over the Central Plains, on the heat dome building across the eastern seaboard, on the second-by-second feeds from social media that have replaced what we used to call the news. It did not kill anyone. It did not knock down a single building of consequence. It did not even produce a tsunami. The wave that the rupture briefly threatened the United States National Tsunami Warning System with. The wave that triggered a single advisory bulletin at 14:59 and 12 seconds, Coordinated Universal Time, 9 minutes after the rupture began, never arrived because it was never quite generated. So by the standards that determine what makes the news in the year 2026, this was nothing. A magnitude 6 earthquake, 10 miles down, in a place most Americans cannot find on a map. The kind of event that happens approximately 140 times per year on this planet, give or take. The kind of event you can scroll past on the way to the algorithm's next attempt to hold your attention. But the address of an earthquake is sometimes more important than its magnitude. And the address of this one matters in ways that almost no one in mainstream American news coverage is going to tell you about, because telling you about it would require explaining a piece of the planet that mainstream American news coverage has spent approximately 183 years not explaining. Tonight, in the next 2 hours, we are going to do that explaining. We are going to walk you through what just happened, what fault it happened on, what that fault is, what it has done in the past, what it is capable of doing in the future, what science actually knows and does not know about how much strain it is currently storing, what infrastructure exists to warn you if it ruptures, what infrastructure does not exist, and why. Even though somewhere between 6 and 7 million people live in the direct exposure footprint of this fault, even though another 30 million tourists annually sleep within an evacuation horizon they cannot outrun, even though this fault has killed 6,000 people in a single morning within living historical memory, this entire system is essentially absent from the public conversation about North American seismic hazard. That is the entire video tonight. One earthquake, 56 seconds long, 60 miles from a town most Americans have never heard of. And the system it just reminded us we have been ignoring for almost 2 centuries. Let me give you the actual data on the rupture itself, because that is where every honest deep dive has to start. The event occurred at 1450 hours, 6 seconds, 0.67, Coordinated Universal Time. In local terms, that is 10:50 in the morning Atlantic Standard Time. Saturday morning, late breakfast hour on the islands, a normal pre-lunch hour for the cruise ships in port at Antigua and St. Kitts. The location, according to the European Mediterranean Seismological Centre, the European equivalent of the United States Geological Survey, headquartered in France, operating an independent global earthquake detection and characterization network, was 17.257 degrees north, 61.327 degrees west. That is east of Barbuda, in the open Atlantic, in waters that are some of the deepest in the Caribbean basin. The US Geological Survey, working from a different global network of seismic stations, fit the same event to a slightly different location, but the two solutions agree on the essentials. It was offshore, it was east of the volcanic arc islands, and it sat within the boundary zone where the North American tectonic plate descends westward, beneath the Caribbean tectonic plate. The magnitude was 6.0. Both agencies, USGS and EMSC, converged on that number, working independently, with different software, different inversion methods, and different station networks. The agreement is meaningful. It means the magnitude is what the magnitude is. It is not, as some of the conversations on social media in the hours after the rupture suggested, the result of either agency downgrading the event to suppress public concern. When two independent agencies, on two continents, separated by an ocean, arrive at the same number using independent methods, the most parsimonious explanation is that the number is correct. The depth is where the two agencies disagree. And this is the part of the data that nobody has been talking about, but which probably matters more than the magnitude itself. USGS placed the hypocenter, the actual three-dimensional point in the Earth's crust where the rupture began, at 30.038 kilometers below the surface. EMSC placed it at 58.9 kilometers below the surface. The difference between those two solutions is 29 kilometers, roughly 18 miles. That is a real disagreement. In a properly instrumented region, California, the Pacific Northwest, central Japan, the two agencies would typically agree on the depth of a moderate earthquake within a few kilometers. A 29-kilometer disagreement is at the high end of normal for any region, and it tells us something specific about the region this event occurred in. The seismic network east of the Lesser Antilles arc is sparse. There are not enough seismometers close enough to the rupture to pin down the depth tightly. The agencies are working from teleseismic recordings, signals that have travelled thousands of kilometres through the Earth before reaching the recording stations. And those signals, by the time they arrive at the stations, have lost the high-frequency information that allows precise depth resolution. And this is more than a technical detail because the depth determines what kind of earthquake this was. At 30 kilometres depth, the USGS solution, the rupture is plausibly very close to or on the plate interface itself. The interface is the surface where the North American plate is in contact with the overriding Caribbean plate. Earthquakes on the interface are what builds, and what releases, the strain that drives the largest possible earthquakes in any subduction zone. They are the Megathrust events. They are what we worry about. At 59 kilometers depth, the EMSC solution, the rupture is well below the interface, inside the downgoing North American slab itself. Earthquakes inside the descending slab are called intraslab events. They release stress that has built up inside the plate itself, due to bending, due to thermal contraction, due to the geometric distortions of being shoved into the mantle at an oblique angle. Intraslab events can be destructive. The 2001 Nisqually earthquake in Washington state was an intraslab event, but they are essentially decoupled from the strain budget that drives the largest interface ruptures. In other words, the question of which depth is correct for Saturday's event is the question of whether the earthquake was a tiny relief valve, releasing a fraction of the strain that the megathrust has been accumulating since 1843, or whether it was an internal stress release inside the descending plate that has essentially nothing to do with the megathrust at all. We probably will never know which one is right for this specific event. The data are too thin, the network is too sparse, the rupture is too far offshore. What we can say with confidence is that the event happened in the region where it matters most, and it happened in the depth range where the interpretation matters most, and the ambiguity itself is part of the story. The shaking was felt across the entire Leeward Islands: Antigua, Barbuda, St. Kitts, Nevis, Montserrat, Anguilla, Sint Maarten and St. Martin, St. Barthélemy, Guadeloupe, the northern coast of the United States Virgin Islands, the northeastern corner of Puerto Rico. Reports from across this region describe between 30 and 45 seconds of slow, rolling, low-frequency motion. The kind of motion that does not throw items off shelves, the kind of motion that wakes you up if you're still sleeping, and that makes you look up from your coffee if you are not. The kind of motion that you tell yourself almost immediately was probably nothing, No buildings of consequence collapsed. No people died. The US Geological Survey's prompt assessment of global earthquakes for response system, PAGER, issued a green level alert. Green is the lowest of 4 categories. Green means that, given the magnitude and depth and population exposure and local building stock, the system expects fewer than 1 fatality and less than $1 million in damage with very high probability. The PAGER green assessment for this event was correct. The casualty count is 0. The damage count is, as far as anyone has reported as of the moment we are recording, also essentially 0. But here is where the unusual part of the post-event response shows up. 9 minutes after the rupture began, at 14:59 and 12 seconds Coordinated Universal Time, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration logged a tsunami warning entry for near the Leeward Islands, Caribbean Sea. Latitude 70,600 north, longitude 61,000 west. The warning bulletin was advisory rather than active, meaning it alerted regional authorities to the possibility of wave generation rather than commanding evacuation, and it was allowed to expire without escalation. No wave came, no coast was struck, but 9 minutes. That is a fast warning interval, and it is worth holding that number for a moment because the warning interval matters very much for what we're going to talk about in the rest of this video. If a magnitude 8 earthquake had ruptured on the Lesser Antilles Megathrust on Saturday morning, instead of a magnitude 6, the very first wave from that rupture would have reached the nearest populated coast in approximately the same 9 minutes. The warning system performed adequately for the moderate event that actually occurred. The same system, run identically, would have arrived at the same moment as the wave it was warning about. For the event it is nominally designed to warn against. That is not a failure of the warning system. That is a geometric property of the geography. The fault is close, the shoreline is close. The wave does not care about the human institutions that exist to warn about it. Now, Saturday's M6 is the third magnitude 6 or greater event in the Eastern Caribbean since the start of 2024. None of them have killed anyone. None of them have produced significant tsunamis. None of them have made the front page of any major American newspaper. They form, in the language of seismology, a steady background drumbeat, the routine expression of a tectonic system that is, by every available measurement, releasing strain energy at a pace consistent with its long-term rate. But the address of every one of these 3 events is the same. It is the address of a fault system that, in February of 1843, killed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people in a single morning. A fault system that has interacted with a transoceanic tsunami that crossed the Atlantic Ocean from a source 4,000 miles away in 1755. A fault system whose southern flank hosts the only currently active submarine volcano in the entire Caribbean basin, capable of independently generating a tsunami in its own right. A fault system on which 7 million people live in the direct exposure footprint and on which another 30 million tourists annually sleep within the same horizon. So this video is not about the magnitude 6 earthquake. The earthquake is the news peg. The earthquake is the reason your newsfeed surfaced the word Antigua to you this weekend, if it surfaced it at all. The earthquake is, in some honest sense, almost a pretext. This video is about the fault itself. The fault that the M6 just briefly, quietly, almost imperceptibly reminded us is still there. The fault that has been reminded of by a lot of M6s in a lot of regions over a lot of decades, while the rest of the world was looking the other way, and the first thing we need to do before we can talk about that fault is to name it. Part 2. The address matters more than the magnitude. The Lesser Antilles Megathrust. Say the words out loud. They are an unfamiliar combination, even for people who follow geology and earth science casually. The Lesser Antilles is not a phrase most Americans hear in any context other than vacation marketing copy. The word megathrust is something most of us associate with Cascadia, with Japan, with Chile, with Sumatra. Names that come preloaded with documentary footage, with movie scripts, with the visceral imagery of 1995 computer-generated tsunamis sweeping inland over a Tokyo coastline. But the Lesser Antilles is the chain of volcanic arc islands that runs in a gentle curve along the eastern boundary of the Caribbean basin. Starting in the north, the curve begins with the islands of Anguilla, St. Martin and Sint Maarten, and St. Barthélemy. It continues south through St. Kitts and Nevis, through Montserrat. the island whose southern half was buried by a stratovolcano in the late 1990s and remains an officially evacuated exclusion zone today, and then continues through Guadeloupe, Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, the Grenadines, and ends at the southern tip of the arc at the island of Grenada. The curve traces, almost exactly, the line where one tectonic plate is descending beneath another. The descending plate in this case is the North American plate. Yes, the same North American plate that California is sitting on and that the eastern seaboard is sitting on. The plate is shaped like a long slab of crustal rock that extends from the western United States all the way east across the Atlantic to the mid-Atlantic ridge, and then continues farther east as oceanic crust until it reaches the eastern edge of the Caribbean basin. There, at the eastern boundary of the Caribbean, the oceanic part of the North American plate is bending downward and being shoved westward into the mantle underneath the overriding Caribbean plate. The rate of this convergence is approximately 18 to 20 millimeters per year. In American units, that is about 3/4 of an inch per year, about the rate at which your fingernails grow. That number, 18 to 20 millimeters per year, comes from decades of GPS measurements made by survey markers planted on the islands and on the surrounding plates, measured by satellites against fixed reference frames over years and years of data accumulation. It is one of the most reliable numbers in modern geodesy. It is the rate at which the North American plate is currently disappearing beneath the Lesser Antilles arc. That rate is moderate by global standards. The Pacific plate descends beneath the Japan Trench at roughly 4 times that rate, 80 to 90 millimeters per year. The Nazca plate descends beneath South America at roughly 70. The Juan de Fuca plate descends beneath Cascadia at roughly 40. By those numbers, the Lesser Antilles is a slow subduction zone, but slow does not mean harmless. Slow means the recurrence time between large events is longer. It does not mean the events themselves are smaller. A subduction zone moving at 20 millimeters per year accumulates the strain for a magnitude 8 earthquake in approximately 200 years. A subduction zone moving at 80 millimeters per year accumulates the same strain in approximately 50 years. The fault on the seafloor, when it finally ruptures, releases the strain that has been stored. Slow loading just means the storage period is longer, and the Lesser Antilles arc has a geometric property that is genuinely unusual on a global scale. It is, as far as anyone has carefully checked, the only subduction zone in the world where the chain of land-based volcanic arc cities sits directly above the locked portion of the plate interface. Compare this to Cascadia, where the Pacific Northwest cities of Portland and Seattle sit 150 kilometers landward of the subduction trench, distant enough that a megathrust rupture's tsunami requires 15 to 25 minutes of travel time to reach the inhabited coast. Compare it to the Japan Trench, where the eastern coast of Honshu sits a similar distance west of the trench. Compare it to South America, where Lima and Santiago similarly sit inland of their respective subduction trenches. The Lesser Antilles arc is different. The volcanic arc islands themselves, Antigua, Guadeloupe, Martinique, the entire string, sit, geologically speaking, on the seismogenic wedge. They are the surface expression of the magma generated by the descending plate. They are not behind the trench, they are above the locked interface. The trench is east of them, the descending plate is below them, and the towns built on those islands, Pointe-à-Pitre on Guadeloupe, Fort-de-France on Martinique, St. John's on Antigua, Basseterre on St. Kitts, every coastal settlement on every island, sit at sea level on flat coastal plains, on land that was created by the same tectonic system that, when it ruptures, will produce both the shaking and the wave at essentially the same instant. There is, geometrically, no separation between the people and the fault. They are sitting on top of it. This is the property that makes the Lesser Antilles unique. Cascadia kills you with a wave that arrives 15 minutes after the shaking. The Lesser Antilles arc, if it produces a comparable rupture, kills you with shaking and a wave that arrive within the same minute. There is no 15-minute window to remember the evacuation drill. There is no time to grab the go bag. The wave is born underneath you, and it arrives at you at the speed at which a tsunami travels in shallow water, which is roughly the speed of a freight train. Now, for the rest of this video, you should know that the system we are describing is not new science. None of this is hidden. None of this is suppressed. None of this is conspiracy. The papers are published. The maps are public. The geodetic GPS time series are available for download by any graduate student with an internet connection. and a working knowledge of MATLAB. The historical records of every catastrophic event we're about to walk through were written down by colonial administrators, by missionaries, by ship captains, by newspaper correspondents, by the survivors themselves. The information is in the public domain. What is missing is the public consciousness. Cascadia, in the past 15 years, has acquired a cultural presence in North American thought that did not previously exist. The 2015 New Yorker essay, The Really Big One, the Oregon Public Broadcasting documentary Unprepared, the constant cycle of articles, podcasts, university public outreach events, the Federal Emergency Management Agency exercises. Cascadia is now, for any educated American who follows earth science news at all, a known entity. The same is true of the Japan Trench after 2011. The same is true of the San Andreas. The same is true even of the New Madrid seismic zone in the central United States, despite its last major rupture being more than 2 centuries ago. The Lesser Antilles megathrust does not exist in any of these cultural registers. It has produced no documentaries. It has been the subject of no major network news features. It has acquired no shorthand in the public mind. It is, by every measurable cultural metric, the forgotten megathrust. That is the thumbnail of this video. That is the central thesis of the next 100 minutes. And the reason we know what this forgotten megathrust is capable of doing, the reason we can speak with any confidence about what its full rupture capacity actually is because of what it did one morning 183 years ago on the island of Guadeloupe, to which we now turn. Part 3, Pointe-à-Pitre, February the 8th, 1843. On the morning of Wednesday, February the 8th, 1843, the town of Pointe-à-Pitre on the island of Grande-Terre, the eastern of the 2 main islands that make up Guadeloupe, was the second busiest port in the French Caribbean. Roughly 16,000 permanent residents, a merchant quarter that ran along the harbour front and included some of the most substantial stone and brick buildings on the entire arc, a cathedral, completed only a few decades earlier, dominating the upper end of the town with twin towers visible from sea, a garrison, a French colonial administration, the usual layered constellation of merchants, planters, dock workers, ship's crews, enslaved people on the sugar estates inland, free people of colour in the town quarters, travelling foreign nationals doing business in the Central Caribbean Trading Network. The weather that morning was unremarkable. Late winter in the tropics is a pleasant season. The trade winds blowing steadily from the northeast, the air mild, the harbour calm. Pointe-à-Pitre had been founded in 1764 and had grown steadily for 80 years. It had been damaged before by hurricanes. One in 1793 had been particularly bad, and had been rebuilt each time. The town's stone and brick architecture was, by colonial standards, substantial. It was not the kind of a light construction you might find in a more recently settled outpost. People in Pointe-à-Pitre had been building with weight for 2 generations. At approximately 10:35 in the morning, local time, the precise moment is variously logged in different contemporary accounts, but most agree on a time within a few minutes of 10:35. The ground beneath Pointe-à-Pitre began to move. Witnesses described it as starting with a low, indistinct rumble, of the kind that several survivors compared to distant artillery fire. Within seconds, the rumble became shaking. The shaking became severe, and the severe shaking lasted, by the timed observations of multiple independent witnesses, between 70 and 90 seconds. You should hold that number for a moment. 70 to 90 seconds. A moderate earthquake, the kind that wakes you up and rattles dishes, lasts perhaps 5 to 15 seconds of strong shaking. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake in California, a magnitude 6.9 that killed 63 people and collapsed sections of the Bay Bridge, lasted approximately 15 seconds of strong motion at most stations. The 1994 Northridge earthquake, magnitude 6.7, 57 dead, billions of dollars in damage to the Los Angeles basin, lasted approximately 10 to 15 seconds. What the people of Pointe-à-Pitre experienced on February the 8th, 1843, was longer than either of those by a factor of 5 to 7. It was the duration of shaking that, in modern seismology, is associated only with the very largest events, with ruptures whose fault planes are hundreds of kilometres long, ripping at a speed of 2 to 3 kilometres per second, taking minutes to complete because the fault itself is that long. The cathedral was the first major building to fall. Contemporary accounts describe the twin towers swaying perceptibly through the first 10 seconds of shaking then leaning, then collapsing inward and downward. The bells, mounted in the upper towers, swung wildly and then crashed into the rubble below. Several priests and lay people inside the cathedral at the time of the rupture were killed by the falling stone of the towers and the collapsing nave roof. The same earthquake destroyed the cathedral at Basse-Terre, the older capital city on the western island of Guadeloupe, through the same mechanism. The merchant quarter fell next. The stone and brick buildings of Pointe-à-Pitre's commercial centre had been built for hurricanes and for the steady tropical heat. They had not been built for ground motion that would last more than a minute. The buildings had been engineered, to the extent that the word engineered applies to colonial-era construction, against horizontal wind loads, not against horizontal ground accelerations. They came apart at the corners, they came apart at the window openings, they came apart at the joints between wall and roof. By the time the shaking stopped, an estimated 3/4 of the substantial buildings in the town had either collapsed or been so structurally compromised as to be uninhabitable. The fires started almost immediately. In the colonial Caribbean of the early 19th century, ordinary life ran on open flame, cooking fires, lanterns, workshop furnaces, tobacco. The earthquake collapsed the buildings around those flames, scattering coals and embers into the wood of broken doors and the dry cloth of fallen draperies. By midday, multiple separate fires were burning across what remained of Pointe-à-Pitre. By the next morning, the fires had joined and were consuming whole districts of the town. The conflagration lasted approximately 3 days. By the time it burned out, it had destroyed what the earthquake had not. The death toll has been variously estimated. Contemporary French colonial reports, counted in the weeks after the event, when bodies were being recovered from the rubble and tallied from the parish registers, put the dead at approximately 5,000 to 6,000 on the island of Guadeloupe alone. Some later estimates, drawn from incomplete recovery and accounting for the bodies never identified or recovered, pushed the number as high as 8,000. The most commonly cited number in modern seismological literature is the middle of that range, roughly 6,000 dead on Guadeloupe. Casualties were also reported on Antigua, on Montserrat, on Nevis, on St. Kitts, across the entire northern Lesser Antilles arc. The death tolls on those islands were much smaller, tens to low hundreds at most, but the shaking was severe enough to cause structural damage and collapse on every island within roughly 500 kilometers of the rupture. The earthquake was felt as far north as the US Virgin Islands and as far south as Trinidad. It was felt, as the historical record describes, throughout the West Indies. Two things about the 1843 event are essential to understand, because they govern everything that follows in the next 200 years of seismology in this region. The first is the absence of a significant tsunami. The second is the magnitude. The absence of the tsunami is the first thing the geologists who study this event noticed when they began re-examining it in the late 20th century, and it is the source of some of the deepest puzzles. An earthquake long enough to shake Pointe-à-Pitre for 70 to 90 seconds should, by every theoretical model of subduction zone rupture, have produced a major tsunami. The vertical seafloor deformation associated with a rupture of that duration and that mechanism is normally enough to displace a column of seawater equivalent to many cubic kilometers, which is what generates tsunamis. The fact that no significant wave was recorded is, in the modern interpretation, evidence either that the rupture occurred somewhat inland of the main offshore megathrust, perhaps on a backthrust within the arc itself rather than on the principal subducting interface, or that the slip distribution along the fault was such that the vertical component of seafloor displacement was minimized despite the long duration of shaking. This matters, because if the 1843 event was on a backthrust within the arc, rather than on the main offshore megathrust, then the main offshore megathrust is itself still loaded with whatever strain it had at the time. The 1843 event might not, in that interpretation, have released the strain on the principal interface at all. The strain budget that has been accumulating for 200 years might still be substantially intact, because the 1843 event released only a backthrust's worth of it. That is a worse scenario, not a better one. It means that the question, when did the offshore megathrust last release a major rupture, might have an answer further back in the past than 1843, and the elapsed time on the offshore portion might be 3 or 4 centuries rather than less than 2. This interpretation is contested. Other reconstructions of the 1843 event place the rupture closer to the principal interface and account for the absence of a tsunami through reduced vertical slip. Both interpretations are consistent with the available data. Neither can be definitively ruled in or out, but notice what both interpretations have in common. They both confirm that the Lesser Antilles arc, in living historical memory, has produced a rupture long enough and large enough to shake the closest population centre for 90 seconds and kill 6,000 people. Whether the rupture was on the offshore megathrust or on a backthrust within the arc, the strain energy required to produce that rupture had to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is the subduction system as a whole. The system is capable. The question is only how the capacity is distributed across the various faults within it. Part 4. 3 meters of accumulated slip deficit. That brings us to the magnitude. Estimating the magnitude of an earthquake from the era before seismographs is a technical art that has improved substantially over the past 100 years. The basic method is straightforward in principle and very difficult in practice. You take the documented accounts of damage from the historical record, how many buildings collapsed, what the radius of damage was, how far the shaking was felt at various intensities. You convert those damage observations into modified Mercalli intensity values at each documented location. You then invert the intensity distance pattern back to a single best fit magnitude using calibration data from modern, instrumentally recorded earthquakes of known magnitude that produce similar intensity patterns at similar distances. The method is not perfect, and the answers depend on the quality of the historical record and on the assumptions you make about how local geology amplifies or attenuates shaking at each documented location. The 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake has been the subject of at least half a dozen significant magnitude re-estimations over the past century and a half. The first serious effort in the 1920s placed the event at approximately magnitude 7.5. The mid-20th century estimates range from 7.5 to 7.8. The late 20th century estimates pushed slightly higher to 7.8 to 8.0. The early 21st century estimates have continued the upward trend. The most influential modern reanalysis was published in 2011 by Nathalie Feuillet and her colleagues, working primarily at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris. Feuillet and her team did a comprehensive reanalysis of the macroseismic intensity data from across the entire affected region: Guadeloupe, Antigua, Montserrat, Nevis, St. Kitts, the Virgin Islands, all the way south to Trinidad, and combined the intensity pattern with damage radius arguments calibrated against modern instrumented megathrust events. Their conclusion was that the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake had a moment magnitude in the range of 8.0 to 8.5. That is the published estimate that has now been widely adopted in the scientific literature. An independent reanalysis by Susan Haff at the US Geological Survey in 2013, using slightly different methods, came to a comparable conclusion. The current scientific consensus, to the extent that the phrase scientific consensus can be applied to a contested historical estimate, is that the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake was probably a magnitude 8.0 to 8.5 event. Hold that number against what we said in the first part of this video. Saturday's event was magnitude 6.0. The 1843 event was somewhere between magnitude 8.0 and magnitude 8.5. The difference is between 2 and 2.5 magnitude units, and because the magnitude scale is logarithmic, and because the energy release scales not with magnitude itself, but with magnitude raised to the 1.5 power, a magnitude 8 earthquake releases approximately 1,000 times more energy than a magnitude 6. A magnitude 8.5 releases approximately 5,000 times more. What happened on the same fault system in 1843, on the same arc, between the same two tectonic plates, was 3 orders of magnitude larger in energy release than what happened on Saturday. The contrast is not subtle. Now consider what has happened since 1843. If we take the magnitude 8 to 8.5 estimate seriously, then the segment of the arc that ruptured in 1843 has been quietly accumulating strain again at a rate of approximately 18 to 20 millimeters per year for 183 years. The total accumulated slip deficit on the segment, the amount of motion that would have occurred on the fault if it had been slipping smoothly at the plate convergence rate, but did not because the fault was locked, is on the order of 3 to 3.5 meters. 3 meters of accumulated slip deficit. The kind of stored strain that, in a subduction zone, only resolves through one mechanism: the abrupt release in a major earthquake. This is the part of the science that nobody is comfortable with, because it requires holding two ideas at the same time that pull against each other. The first idea is that subduction zones do not behave like clockwork. The interval between great earthquakes is not regular. It is quasi-periodic, meaning the events cluster in time with a characteristic average interval, but with very large fluctuations around that average. A subduction zone with a 500-year mean recurrence interval has produced consecutive events 400 years apart, and consecutive events 900 years apart and all the spacings in between, and there is no way to predict from the elapsed time alone which interval the next one will fall into. The second idea is that the elapsed time since the last event is not zero, and the strain that drove that last event has been reaccumulating. 183 years of strain accumulation at 18 to 20 millimeters per year is approximately the amount of slip that needs to release in a magnitude 8 earthquake. The system is not overloaded exactly. It is also not underloaded. It is, by the best available numbers, somewhere in the range of where you might expect the next event to begin to be a possibility. Not a certainty, not even a probability in any precise sense, just a possibility that has gone from essentially zero recently after the last event to non-trivial after a couple of centuries of reloading. This is the framing that responsible seismologists use, and it is also the framing that gets distorted in both directions by everyone else. On one side, you will see the framing simplified down to an earthquake is overdue, which is empirically and conceptually wrong, because subduction zones do not run on schedules. On the other side, you will see the framing simplified down to the 1843 event released the strain, so we're fine, which is also wrong, because the 1843 event was over 5 generations ago, and the strain has been reaccumulating ever since. The honest framing, the one nobody likes because it doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, is we are within the recurrence time uncertainty range. We don't know the year, we don't know the decade, we probably don't even know the century with any confidence. What we know is that the strain has been building, the system has produced large events before, and our ability to predict the timing of the next one is essentially zero. And Saturday's event, that magnitude 6 off the coast of Barbuda, is not, in any technically defensible sense, a warning shot. Foreshocks before large megathrust events do happen, but the base rate is small. Somewhere in the range of 5 to 10% of large subduction zone earthquakes are preceded by an identifiable foreshock sequence in the same source area within the preceding weeks or months. And foreshocks, when they do occur, are recognizable as foreshocks only in retrospect. By the time you've identified the foreshock, you have already had the main shock, and the identification consists of looking back at the seismograph record and saying, that earlier event, the one nobody worried about, that was probably a foreshock. Saturday's event might, in 5 years or in 500 years, be looked back on by someone with the same retrospective hindsight. It might also be looked back on by no one, because it might not have been related to anything at all. There is no way to know in advance. The base rate is too low. What Saturday's event is, more honestly, is a reminder. Not a warning, in the sense of a predictive signal. A reminder in the sense that the system is alive, that the bookkeeping of strain is being done in real time, that the fault that destroyed Pointe-à-Pitre in 1843 is still there, still loaded, still gradually accumulating the energy that drove that event and eventually will drive another like it. That is the central thing this video is about. Not the M6. The M6 is the pretext. The thing the M6 just reminded us of, the existence and the loaded state of a major subduction zone fault system that almost no one in North America knows is there, is the actual story. In Pointe-à-Pitre today, in 2026, the population is approximately 15,000. The town has been rebuilt. The waterfront is busy with cruise ships and merchant traffic. The cathedral, rebuilt after the 1843 collapse and rebuilt again after subsequent damage, stands at the upper end of the town with twin towers that look very much like the ones that fell almost 2 centuries ago. The merchant quarter is busy with restaurants and shops and modern office space. The colonial buildings that survived the earthquake, and there were some, are now historic preservation sites. The harbour is full of boats. Approximately 395,000 people live on Guadeloupe today. That is roughly 30 times the population of the island at the time of the 1843 earthquake. The infrastructure of the modern Guadeloupean economy, the power plants, the desalination facilities, the airport, the principal hospital, the cruise terminal, is concentrated on the coastal plain in zones that would experience strong shaking in any future event comparable to 1843, and that would experience destructive tsunami inundation in any rupture that produced significant vertical seafloor displacement. The earthquake-resistant building code on Guadeloupe is, by French standards, modest. The island is metropolitan French territory, governed under the same legal framework as continental France, and the construction codes have been updated periodically to require earthquake-resistant design in new construction. But the building stock dates substantially from the mid-20th century, before the modern French Eurocode 8 seismic provisions were introduced. The retrofit rate on older buildings has been slow. The hospital, the principal trauma centre for the entire Lesser Antilles French territories, was constructed in an era and to a code that predates current understanding of arc megathrust hazard. This is not to predict that any specific building will fail in any specific future event. It is to note that the population density on the fault has multiplied 30-fold, the infrastructure dependence has multiplied 100-fold, and the earthquake resistance of the built environment has not multiplied at anything close to the same rate. The 1843 event, repeated today in the same location with the same magnitude, would produce a casualty count substantially higher than 1843 produced, not because the rupture would be worse, but because there is so much more in the way. And Guadeloupe is one island. The next part of this video is about the rest of the arc, and what its history tells us about the system this fault sits inside. Part 5. The USS Monongahela and the Anegada Passage Wave. The afternoon of November the 18th, 1867, 24 years and 9 months after Pointe-à-Pitre, a different segment of the same plate boundary system produced a different kind of event with a different kind of consequence. This one happened in the Anegada Passage, the deep water channel that separates the British and US Virgin Islands from the northern Leeward Islands. The Anegada Passage is, geologically, the transition zone between two distinct fault systems. North of the passage, the plate boundary is dominated by the strike-slip faults that run east-west along the northern margin of the Puerto Rico Trench. South of the passage, the boundary transitions into the subduction megathrust of the Lesser Antilles arc proper. The Anegada Passage itself is the geometric junction, a region of extension, normal faults, and complex strain partitioning, with structures that have produced damaging earthquakes throughout the documented historical record. The 1867 event began at approximately 2:45 in the afternoon local time. The magnitude is now estimated at approximately 7.5 on the basis of macroseismic intensity reanalysis, comparable to the work done on the 1843 event. The hypercenter was beneath the Anegada Passage seafloor at a depth of approximately 20 kilometers, relatively shallow for the region. The shaking was felt across the entire eastern Caribbean. In Frederiksted, the principal port town on the western coast of St. Croix, in what was then the Danish West Indies and is now the US Virgin Islands, the shaking lasted approximately a minute. Damage in the town was severe, but not catastrophic. The colonial sugar warehouses along the waterfront were structurally compromised. The garrison reported wall cracks. Several merchant buildings collapsed. The death toll from the shaking alone was small, fewer than a dozen. Then, within minutes, the tsunami arrived. Contemporary accounts from Frederiksted describe the sea first withdrawing dramatically from the harbour, the bay floor exposed, fish flopping on the mud, small boats grounded, and then returning in a series of waves. The largest wave is variously estimated at between 6 and 7 metres in height where it reached the waterfront. It overwhelmed the town's lower streets, carried debris inland for several hundred metres, and accounted for the majority of the event's eventual death toll. Across the entire region, St. Croix, St. Thomas, the British Virgin Islands, the northern Lesser Antilles, approximately 30 people died in the combined earthquake and tsunami sequence. The majority of those deaths were drowning deaths in Frederiksted. The single most famous incident of the 1867 event, the one that ended up in 19th century newspapers from London to Boston, was the carrying inland of the United States naval steamship Monongahela. The Monongahela was a wooden-hulled corvette of 1,900 tons, anchored in Frederiksted Harbour at the time of the rupture. When the tsunami arrived, the ship was lifted off her anchorage by the incoming wave and carried, by the historical accounts, between 300 and 400 feet inland from the original waterline. The ship came to rest in what had been, the morning of the earthquake, a residential block. She did not break apart. She survived the entire transit on her keel. The story of what came next in the months after the rupture is one of the small jewels of 19th century maritime engineering. The Monongahela could not simply be refloated. The wave that brought her in was a one-time event, and the surrounding land was now dry. The US Navy's solution, executed over a period of weeks, was to construct a series of inclined wooden ramps and to drag the ship, a 1,900-ton wooden warship, back to the water by overland traction. The pulling was done by teams of horses, drafted from across the island for the purpose. The transit took approximately 3 months. The ship was eventually returned to seawater and refloated. She continued in US naval service for another 2 decades, and was finally lost in an Atlantic storm in 1891, a quarter century after she had been picked up and carried inland by a wave. The Monongahela story is the dramatic core of the 1867 event in American memory, to the extent that the 1867 event has any American memory at all. The 30 drowned in Frederiksted are less prominent in the historical record. But the seismological significance of the event is not in the ship, and not in the body count. It is in the documentary proof that the Caribbean basin produces destructive, locally generated tsunamis on a timescale of minutes after the rupture, and that the geographic distribution of where those tsunamis can be generated includes not just the main subduction megathrust to the south, but also the Anegada Passage transition zone, the strike-slip faults to the north, and possibly other structures we do not yet have a comprehensive map of. The connection back to the central narrative of this video is direct. Saturday's M6 occurred on the Lesser Antilles arc proper, south of the Anegada Passage, but the 1867 event occurred on a directly adjacent plate boundary segment, north of where Saturday's event occurred, in a region that is part of the same continuous tectonic system. The 1867 event is the documentary evidence that this region, in the lifetime of people whose grandchildren are still alive in some cases, produced a destructive local source tsunami that arrived within minutes of the rupture. It is the empirical proof that the warning system in this part of the world cannot afford to assume the threats are only from sources far away. Part 6. The Lisbon Tsunami that crossed the Atlantic. There is one more historical event that has to be on the wall when we talk about Caribbean tsunami exposure, and it is in some ways the strangest of them all, because it is the event that proves the Caribbean basin is exposed to tsunamis generated by earthquakes that happen on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. November the 1st, 1755. All Saints' Day in the Catholic calendar, the morning, the city of Lisbon, Portugal, in the early 18th century one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, capital of a global maritime empire, with a population of approximately 200,000. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, local time, the ground in Lisbon began to shake. The shaking was severe and lasted approximately 6 minutes. Most of central Lisbon collapsed. The Royal Palace, the Opera House, the Principal Cathedral, the Merchant Exchange, the libraries, the convents, everything went down. The fires that started in the rubble eventually consumed most of what remained standing. The death toll in Lisbon alone is estimated at 30,000 to 40,000. Across the broader region, Iberia, Morocco, southern Spain, the death toll is estimated at 60,000 to 100,000. But Lisbon was not the only damage centre. The earthquake, now estimated at moment magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, on the basis of decades of modern reanalysis of the macroseismic and historical tide gauge records, generated a tsunami in the Atlantic Ocean. The wave radiated outward from the source, which was offshore of the Iberian coast in a region of complex thrust, faulting now generally identified with the Azores-Gibraltar fracture zone. The wave struck the coasts of Spain, Portugal and Morocco within minutes, drowning thousands more in the lower waterfronts of dozens of coastal cities, and then the wave kept going. Across the Atlantic, at the speed at which tsunamis travel in deep ocean water, which is approximately 700 to 800 kilometers per hour, roughly the cruising speed of a commercial jetliner. 8 to 9 hours after the rupture, the leading wave of the 1755 Lisbon tsunami arrived in the Caribbean. The documentary record of those arrivals is fragmentary, because the colonial record keepers of 1755 did not understand what they were observing. The phenomenon of tele-tsunamis, tsunamis generated thousands of kilometers from where they make landfall, was not a recognized scientific concept in the 18th century. The harbour masters and ship captains who logged the wave arrivals in their journals did not know the wave they were watching had any connection to the earthquake that had happened earlier that day on the other side of the Atlantic. They wrote down what they saw, but they did not connect it to anything. The connection had to be made retroactively decades and centuries later by historians and seismologists working through colonial archives in multiple languages. What the records pieced together indicate is this. At the island of Saba, a tiny Dutch island in the northern Lesser Antilles, the wave entered the harbour and damaged moored vessels. Estimates of wave height there are uncertain, but probably in the range of 2 to 3 metres. At Antigua, the wave was observed and logged but did not cause major damage. Estimated heights were lower, perhaps 1 metre to 1.5 metres. At Martinique, the wave was destructive at the town of Saint-Pierre, the same town that, almost 150 years later, would be destroyed by the Pelée eruption, with wave heights estimated at 4 to 7 metres. At Barbados, the wave was strong enough to be specifically logged by multiple ship captains, with documented heights in the 3 to 5 metre range. The wave arrived in Newfoundland. It was observed in the Azores. It was observed at the West African coast. It was a basin-wide event. The total death toll from the 1755 Telet tsunami in the Caribbean is not precisely documented. It is probably in the low double digits, possibly slightly higher. The wave heights, while substantial, were lower in the Caribbean than they were closer to the Iberian source, and the population exposure on the 18th century coastlines of the Lesser Antilles was much smaller than it is today. But the historical significance of the 1755 event for modern Caribbean tsunami risk is not in the death toll. It is in the proof that the Caribbean basin is exposed to large tsunamis from sources thousands of kilometres away, from sources that no local seismic network can detect in time to provide useful warning, from sources whose ruptures will be felt as shaking only in the immediate source region, meaning that the residents of the Lesser Antilles will, in a future event of this kind, experience nothing on the day of the rupture, and then will receive a wave arrival approximately 9 hours later that has been travelling toward them the entire time. If a magnitude 9 earthquake ruptures tomorrow on the Azores-Gibraltar fracture zone, the modern name for the structural system that generated the 1755 event, the wave radiation pattern would be approximately the same as in 1755, modified only by current bathymetric details. The Eastern Caribbean would be impacted within 9 hours. The wave heights would be comparable. The population exposed on the coasts of the Lesser Antilles today is, again, approximately 30 to 40 times what it was in 1755. The destruction would be on a different scale entirely. This is part of the threat geometry that the central narrative of this video has to embed. The Lesser Antilles Megathrust, the system Saturday's M6 occurred on, is not the only source of tsunami exposure for the islands above it. There is also the directly adjacent Anegada Passage transition zone, capable of local tsunamis like the 1867 event. There is also the basin-wide exposure to transoceanic tsunamis from distant Atlantic sources, demonstrated by 1755. The regional warning system in the Caribbean has to be designed to handle all 3 categories. It is, as we'll see in the next act of this video, only partially designed to handle any of them. Part 7. 1 minute. At Saint-Pierre. There is one more event we have to include in the historical wall, not because it is on the same fault, but because it is in the same arc, and because it is the empirical proof that the Eastern Caribbean's living record of single-event mass casualty disasters is not limited to earthquakes and tsunamis. May the 8th, 1902. Saint-Pierre, Martinique. The same town on the same island that had been damaged by the 1755 Telet tsunami nearly a century and a half earlier. Saint-Pierre in 1902 was the largest city in Martinique and one of the principal trading centres of the French Caribbean, with a population of approximately 26,000 permanent residents and an additional several thousand seasonal workers and visitors. It was sometimes called the Paris of the West Indies. It was famous for its opera house, its botanical gardens, its rum distilleries and its proximity to the volcano on the northern end of the island. The volcano was Mount Pelée, Bald Mountain, a 1,300-metre stratovolcano of the Lesser Antilles arc system. Pelée had been minimally active for centuries. In April of 1902 the activity escalated. Steam vents on the upper flanks intensified. Mud flows appeared in the drainages. By late April, ash was falling on Saint-Pierre on most days. By early May, the entire upper slope of the volcano was incandescent at night. The local newspaper, Les Colonies, urged calm. The governor of Martinique urged calm. There was a municipal election scheduled for May the 11th, and the political establishment had reasons to discourage panic that might have produced a population exodus and disrupted the vote. At 7:52 in the morning on May the 8th, 16 minutes past sunrise, Mount Pelée produced what is now classified as a Pelion-type eruption, a category that did not exist in the volcanological literature before this event and is named for it. A pyroclastic density current, a ground-hugging avalanche of superheated gas, volcanic ash, and rock fragments at temperatures of approximately 700 degrees Celsius, formed at the summit of the volcano and accelerated down the southern flank in the direction of Saint-Pierre. The transit time from the summit to the city, 6 kilometers away, was approximately 90 seconds. The cloud entered the city traveling at an estimated velocity of 150 to 200 meters per second, roughly the speed of a Category 5 hurricane wind, but composed of 700-degree gas, ash, and rock instead of air. Saint-Pierre had no warning. The pyroclastic density current entered the city as a wall of incandescent gas. Buildings collapsed instantly from the heat and pressure. The municipal water reservoirs vaporized. The harbour was set on fire. Ships in port burst into flame within seconds of the cloud's arrival. The estimated death toll in Saint-Pierre and the surrounding area was approximately 28,000 to 30,000, with some estimates running as high as 35,000. The deaths occurred in approximately 1 minute. There were 2 confirmed survivors in Saint-Pierre itself. The first was a cobbler at the southern edge of town, near the limit of the affected zone, who survived with severe burns. The second, more famous, was a prisoner named Ludger Silberis, who was held in the town's stone-walled punishment cell, a small, partially below-ground holding cell with thick walls and a single, small window facing away from the volcano. The walls and the geometry of the cell partially shielded him from the cloud. He survived for 3 days in the rubble before being rescued by passing patrols, and he became, in the years that followed, an attraction with the Barnum and Bailey Circus, where he was advertised as the man who lived through Doomsday. The 1902 Pelée eruption is the deadliest volcanic event of the 20th century. It is part of the same Lesser Antilles arc system that produced the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake, the 1867 Anegada Passage tsunami, and, on Saturday morning, the magnitude 6 earthquake east of Barbuda. The arc is volcanically active as well as seismically active. The two hazards are not independent of each other. Volcanic eruptions on the arc are driven ultimately by the same subducting plate, whose locked interface drives the Megathrust earthquakes. The 1902 event killed 28,000 people in 1 minute. The 1843 event killed 6,000 people in roughly 90 seconds. The arc has, twice in living historical memory, produced single-minute, single-event mass casualty disasters at scales that would be near the upper limit of any modern national emergency response system. A future major rupture on the Lesser Antilles Megathrust would be the seismic counterpart to what Pelée did in 1902. Same arc, same plate system, same coastal cities, same lack of inland refuge. The arithmetic of casualties is different. Earthquakes kill primarily by structural collapse and by tsunami. Volcanoes kill primarily by pyroclastic density current and by lahars. But the scale of human consequence is in the same order of magnitude. This is the system. This is what the M6 on Saturday morning briefly, almost casually reminded us is still there. Part 8. The volcano underneath, the rough water. We have one more piece of geological context to walk through before we can talk about the human exposure picture, and it is, in its own way, the strangest piece of the puzzle. There is, off the southern flank of the Lesser Antilles arc, a submarine volcano named Kikum Jenny. The name comes from sailors. The sea state at the surface above the volcano, in the channel between Grenada and the small island of Ronde to its north, is notoriously rough. The local currents, the seafloor topography, and the geometry of the channel combine to produce standing waves and unpredictable cross swells that have caused trouble for mariners for centuries. The local sailors named the patch of water Kikum Jenny, the Jenny being a sailor's generic name for a small boat, because the sea state would kick small boats over. The volcano underneath the rough water inherited the name from the surface phenomenon. Kikumjeni is currently the only active submarine volcano in the entire Caribbean basin. The summit is approximately 180 metres below the surface of the ocean, in the channel between Grenada and Carriacou. The volcano has been growing for at least several thousand years, building its edifice through repeated submarine eruptions. The summit depth shoals over time, by perhaps 1 to 2 metres per century on average, as each eruption adds material. Multiple researchers have noted that, at the current growth rate, Kikumjeni will breach the ocean surface and become a small island somewhere within the next several centuries to several millennia, a date impossible to predict more precisely because of the irregular eruptive history. The recorded eruptive history begins in 1939, when the volcano produced an eruption that breached the surface as a column of steam and ash and was observed by passing ships. Since then, the University of the West Indies Seismic Research Centre, based in Trinidad and Tobago, has documented at least 12 discrete eruptive episodes of varying magnitudes. The most recent significant unrest occurred in 2015, when a sequence of submarine eruptions and seismic swarms led to the establishment of a maritime exclusion zone of 1.5 kilometres around the volcano's surface position. The exclusion zone remains in effect today. The reason Kikumjeni matters for the central narrative of this video is not its routine eruptive activity, which has produced no significant casualties in the documented record. The reason it matters is the long-term mass-wasting history of the volcanic edifice. The seafloor around Kikumjeni shows clear sedimentary evidence of past large flank collapse events, episodes in which a large portion of the unstable volcanic edifice has detached and slid into the surrounding deep water, producing what would have been, at the time, very large tsunamis. In 2006, a research team led by Anne Lefrion, working at the Institut de Physique du Globe de Paris, published a numerical modelling study examining the tsunami consequences of a hypothetical major flank collapse of Kikumjeni. Their results indicated that a flank collapse of plausible scale, comparable to the events the seafloor record indicates have happened in the past, could generate a regional tsunami with run-up heights, the maximum vertical inundation reached as the wave runs up the shore, of 10 to 30 metres at the closest neighbouring islands. That is, in places, the upper end of what would be physically possible given the available source volume. 10 to 30 metres of run-up at islands like Grenada, Carriacou, Petite Martinique, the southern Grenadines, and the eastern coast of St. Vincent. The estimated travel time from the volcano to those islands, based on the local bathymetry and the wave propagation physics, is in the range of minutes to a few tens of minutes. The implications of this combination, large amplitude wave, very short warning interval, populated and tourist-heavy coastlines that would be directly in the wave's path, are obvious and bad. The 2006 Lefrion study was, when it was published, somewhat controversial within the volcanological community. Some researchers argued that the assumed collapse volume was at the upper limit of what was geologically plausible, and that lower volume scenarios would produce much smaller waves. Subsequent reanalysis and additional seafloor mapping have generally supported the Lefrion team's conclusions that large flank collapse events have occurred in the geological past, and that future large events of comparable scale cannot be ruled out, even if they are not in any given century particularly likely. The relationship between Kikumjeni and the Lesser Antilles megathrust is indirect, but not zero. Major earthquakes on the southern segment of the arc, particularly events with strong shaking propagating into the Grenada region, have the theoretical capacity to destabilize the volcano's flank if the volcanic edifice is already in a critically unstable state. Whether the current edifice is in such a state is something that the available monitoring does not allow us to determine with confidence. The volcano is being watched, in real time, by the Seismic Research Centre, but the watch is for signs of imminent eruptive activity, not for the geotechnical metrics that would predict flank stability. The connection back to the central narrative is the compounded geometry. The Lesser Antilles arc is not just a megathrust earthquake system, it is also a stratovolcano arc. Pelée, Soufrière on Saint Vincent, Soufrière Hills on Montserrat, La Soufrière on Guadeloupe, all currently or recently active. It is also a submarine volcano host, Kikumjeni, with documented flank collapse history. The hazards are interleaved. The exposed populations are the same populations. Part 9. Where the people are and where the mountain is not. When you put the pieces together, and this is the geometric reality that the rest of this video will turn on, what the Lesser Antilles arc presents hazard-wise, is qualitatively different from what Cascadia or Japan present. In Cascadia, the population is concentrated in cities, Portland, Seattle, Vancouver, that sit 150 kilometres inland from the trench. The exposed coastal communities are smaller, less densely populated, and have, in the past 2 decades, received targeted investment in tsunami evacuation infrastructure, including signage, marked routes, drill programs, and in some cases, vertical evacuation towers. The wave travel time from a Cascadia subduction zone rupture to the closest populated coastal towns is on the order of 15 to 25 minutes, which is short, but provides a real evacuation window for any population that has been trained for it. In Japan, the dense coastal population is the dominant feature of the exposure picture, but the Japanese seismic and tsunami early warning systems are arguably the most advanced in the world. Vertical evacuation towers and reinforced upper floors of public buildings are common in coastal communities. The seawall infrastructure in many areas, while it failed catastrophically in 2011, was substantially in place and has been substantially rebuilt and improved. The cultural memory of large tsunamis is institutionalized in school curricula, in evacuation drills, and in the design of municipal emergency response. The Lesser Antilles Arc has neither of these properties. The population is not inland. It is on the coastal plain, in some cases hundreds of meters from the wave generation source. The early warning system is the regional CREBEARS, established in 2005 with infrastructure that lags the Pacific equivalent by approximately 7 decades. The vertical evacuation infrastructure is essentially non-existent across the entire arc. The tsunami inundation mapping is incomplete for most of the English-speaking islands. The cultural memory of a large tsunamis exists in the historical record, but has not, with rare exceptions, been institutionalized in school curricula or in emergency drills. This is the human geography reality that the next act of this video has to make concrete. The fault is what it is. The historical events are what they are. The volcanoes are what they are. The thing that determines how much of that translates into mass casualty in a future event is the preparation gap. The gap between what is geologically possible and what is institutionally ready. That gap, as we will see, is wider than most Americans would assume. Part 10. 7 million permanent residents. The exposure picture begins with a number, 7 million, or, more precisely, somewhere between 6.5 million and 7 million permanent residents live in the direct exposure footprint of the Lesser Antilles Arc system. Let me actually walk through that number, island by island, because it is not the kind of number that comes preloaded in the average American's mental geography of the world. Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States, sits at the northern transition of the Lesser Antilles into the Greater Antilles. Puerto Rico has a population of approximately 3.2 million. That is the largest single national population in the exposure footprint, and it is, in census terms, larger than the populations of 15 US states. 3.2 million Americans, all of them on a single island, all of them within the impact zone of a future Lesser Antilles Megathrust event, or a regional tsunami. The United States Virgin Islands, St. Croix, St. Thomas, St. John, add another approximately 87,000 US citizens. The British Virgin Islands add another 31,000. Anguilla, 16,000. St. Martin and Sint Maarten, the French and Dutch halves of the same small island, with no border crossing required between them. Combined population approximately 75,000. St. Barthélemy, 10,000. Saba and Sint Eustatius, the 2 small Dutch islands east of St. Kitts, combined approximately 5,000. St. Kitts and Nevis, 48,000. Antigua and Barbuda, the country where Saturday's earthquake occurred, 97,000. Montserrat, the island whose southern half is officially evacuated due to the ongoing eruption of the Soufrière Hills volcano, with a residual permanent population of approximately 5,000. Then the French Antilles. Guadeloupe, the island that was destroyed in 1843 and rebuilt since, current population 395,000. Martinique, the island where Pelé erupted in 1902, current population 360,000. Both are full metropolitan French territories, French citizens, French passports, integrated into the European Union, with all the institutional infrastructure that French national status implies. Continuing south. Dominica, 73,000. St. Lucia, 180,000. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 110,000. Grenada, the southernmost full island in the chain, 125,000. Barbados, which sits slightly east of the main arc on its own small platform but is firmly within the regional tsunami exposure footprint, 280,000. Trinidad and Tobago, at the southern transition into the South American continental margin, 1.4 million. Though Trinidad's primary tsunami exposure is from South American sources rather than from the Lesser Antilles Megathrust, and is counted here partly for completeness. Add the numbers. The arc and immediate transition footprint is approximately 6.5 to 7 million permanent residents. The full Caribbean basin exposure to a worst-case basin-wide tsunami, including the northern Caribbean populations of Hispaniola, Cuba, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and the Cayman Islands, adds another 25 to 30 million. The basin-wide exposure number is approximately 35 million. These are not abstract numbers. They represent people in houses, on streets in towns, in countries that have specific geographies. And the geography matters because the way Caribbean coastal populations are physically arranged on the landscape is qualitatively different from the way American coastal populations are arranged. In most of the United States, even on the coast, the population is distributed over significant inland depth. A coastal town has a waterfront block, then a few inland blocks, then suburbs, then exurban country, then, eventually, the interior of the continent. Even in places like Florida, where the entire state is relatively low elevation, the inland extent of population is measured in tens of miles or more. On the smaller islands of the Lesser Antilles, this geometry does not exist. The islands are narrow. Many of them are less than 10 miles across at any point. The interior is mountainous. These are volcanic islands with steep slopes, dense rainforest, no road network across the interior. The habitable land is the coastal plain, the narrow strip between the water and the mountain. The towns are built on that strip. There is, for most coastal residents, no inland to retreat to, within the time interval a local source tsunami would allow. This is the geographic property that makes the Lesser Antilles exposure picture qualitatively worse than the Cascadia equivalent. A Cascadia tsunami evacuation, if executed competently within the 15 to 25 minute warning window, can move a coastal population to higher ground that is geographically available. In the Lesser Antilles, the geographically available higher ground is, in many places, a mountainside with no road access. Vertical evacuation, the construction of purpose-built reinforced structures that can hold a population above the wave for the duration of the inundation, is therefore, in this geography, not a supplementary measure. It is the only measure that physics will allow to work, and vertical evacuation infrastructure across the entire Eastern Caribbean is essentially absent. The most exposed island building stock is older than the modern seismic codes that would have made it survivable. Single-story houses of concrete block on concrete slab with masonry walls and corrugated metal roofs are the dominant construction type across most of the smaller English-speaking islands. This construction is robust against hurricanes. It has been refined over generations specifically against the wind loads of Category 4 and 5 Atlantic hurricanes, but it is not designed against the kind of 70 to 90 second strong ground motion that the 1843 event produced. The behaviour of unreinforced masonry under that kind of shaking is well documented from other regions of the world, and the behaviour is not good. The connection back to the central narrative of this video is direct and simple. The 1843 event killed 6,000 people in a town of 16,000. The same event today, on the same fault, would produce a casualty count whose absolute number would be a function not of the rupture physics, which has not changed, but of the population that has grown 30-fold and of the construction stock that has not kept pace with the seismic understanding. The arithmetic is straightforward and uncomfortable. Part 11. 30 million visitors. There is also the tourist exposure picture, and it is its own category of problem. The Caribbean receives approximately 30 million stay-over visitors per year, visitors who fly in, stay in hotel or rental accommodation for at least one night, and engage with the local economy on a multi-day basis. The stay-over total is distributed across the entire region, but a substantial portion of it lands in the Lesser Antilles, with St. Lucia, Antigua, Barbados, the US Virgin Islands, the French Antilles, and Sint Maarten among the most heavily visited destinations. On top of the stay-over total, the Caribbean adds approximately 28 to 30 million annual cruise ship passenger days. Passengers who arrive in port on a cruise ship spend a single day on shore and depart with the ship the same evening. These visitors share certain characteristics that materially affect what a future major event would mean for them. They are, almost without exception, sleeping in resort properties that have been specifically built at the waterfront, frequently on land that has been engineered to put the bedrooms as close to the beach as the local building code allows. Resort design optimizes for ocean views and beach access. The entire economic logic of the resort industry is built around those amenities. The unintended consequence is that resort properties on the Lesser Antilles are systematically located in the inundation zones for any plausible future tsunami. The visitors are also, again almost without exception, unfamiliar with local evacuation routes. Most resort properties do not include tsunami evacuation information in their standard guest orientation materials. Most cruise terminals do not include evacuation instructions in their port of call signage. A cruise passenger who has spent the previous 3 hours touring a botanical garden has, functionally, no awareness of where to go if the ground starts shaking. Even resort guests, who in principle have a longer time horizon to absorb local safety information, in practice rely entirely on hotel staff to provide guidance, and the staff themselves in many properties have not received tsunami-specific evacuation training. There is also a seasonal pattern in the exposure that is worth noting, because it interlocks with the historical record. Caribbean tourism peaks in the December through April winter months, when North American and European visitors are seeking warm weather destinations to escape their own winters. This is also, by historical coincidence, the season in which the 3 major regional events covered in this video occurred. The 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake was February the 8th. The 1755 Lisbon Telet tsunami arrived in the Caribbean on November the 1st. The 1867 Anegada Passage tsunami was November the 18th. The 2 largest recent earthquakes in the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico region within the past decade, the 2020 Puerto Rico swarm and the 2024 Cayman trough sequence, both occurred in January and December respectively. This is not a meaningful causal pattern. Subduction zone earthquakes do not honour calendars, and the apparent clustering is a sampling artifact of a small historical record. But the operational implication is real. Peak tourism and peak historical event timing overlap. The visitor exposure number is not constant across the year. It peaks at the same time the historical record suggests events have been most numerous. The connection back to the central narrative is straightforward. A future major rupture on the Lesser Antilles Megathrust would impact not just the 7 million permanent residents we walked through in the last part, but also some unknown but substantial fraction of the 30 million annual tourists. The tourist population is, on any given day during the December through April peak, on the order of several 100,000 to perhaps 1 million. The exact number depends on cruise schedules, hotel occupancy and the time of week. But the order of magnitude is clear. There are, at any given moment during the peak season, several 100,000 visiting non-residents in the immediate impact zone. Their preparedness, by every available measure, is essentially zero. Part 12. The warning system that came too late. This brings us to the warning system, which is the youngest part of the story, and the part most subject to change between now and whenever the next major event occurs. The Intergovernmental Coordination Group for the Tsunami and Other Coastal Hazards Warning System for the Caribbean and adjacent regions, known by the acronym Caribii-WSI, was established in 2005 under the auspices of the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO. The establishment was a direct response to the Indian Ocean tsunami of December 26, 2004. That event, generated by a magnitude 9.1 earthquake off the coast of Sumatra, killed approximately 230,000 people across 14 countries. The death toll was driven primarily by the absence of a regional tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean basin. The wave travelled for hours, in some directions, before arriving at coastlines whose populations had no warning that it was coming. In the year after the Indian Ocean event, the world's tsunami warning infrastructure was reassessed. The Pacific Basin had had a regional warning system since 1949. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center, operated by the United States in Honolulu, with regional buy-in from all Pacific Rim countries. The Indian Ocean Basin had not. The Atlantic Basin had not. The Caribbean Basin had not. In 2005 and 2006, regional warning systems were established for all 3 of the previously unserved basins, with the Pacific Tsunami Warning Center providing interim warning issuance for the Atlantic and Caribbean systems until they could develop their own operational capability. The Caribbean Tsunami Warning Program, the US operational arm of the regional system, was established at the National Weather Service Forecast Office in San Juan, Puerto Rico in 2013. The full operational maturity of the Caribe EWS regional system is generally dated to approximately 2015, when the regional protocols, the intercountry communication procedures, and the sea level monitoring network reached a working baseline. As of 2026, the system has been operational for approximately a decade, which is in geological terms an extremely short time compared to the Pacific. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center has been operational since 1949. As of 2026, that is 77 years of continuous operation, including the institutional learning from the 1960 Chilean tsunami, the 1964 Alaska earthquake, the 2011 Tohoku event, and dozens of smaller events that have tested and refined the warning system in real-world conditions. The Caribbean system has been operational for roughly 1/8 of that time. It has not been tested by an event comparable to the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake. Whether it would perform adequately in such a test is, in the most honest formulation, unknown. The current CaribeEU's infrastructure includes approximately 100 sea level monitoring stations distributed across the basin. The Pacific equivalent has approximately 1,000. The ratio is, by area, roughly proportional to the size of the two basins, which means the Caribbean network density is comparable to the Pacific by area, but is roughly half of the Pacific by population at risk. The bias toward area-based deployment rather than population-based deployment is a historical artifact of how the network was funded and built, not a deliberate policy choice. But the practical effect is that the network density in the populated parts of the basin is below what would be ideal. There are also operational gaps that the documented network coverage does not capture. The strong motion accelerometer network for the Eastern Caribbean, the network of instruments that record the ground accelerations during an earthquake and allow seismologists to constrain the magnitude, the depth, and the rupture extent within seconds of the event, is sparse east of the arc. The May 16th earthquake's depth disagreement, which we walk through in the first part of this video, is the consequence of exactly this network gap. The network can detect the event, but it cannot tightly constrain the event's properties in the short time window that matters for warning issuance. The inundation mapping problem is the other operational gap. Detailed tsunami inundation maps, street by street, building by building, depth of flooding by depth of flooding maps that translate an offshore tsunami source into specific predicted inundation at each coastal location, exist for some parts of the Caribbean and not for others. Puerto Rico has reasonably complete mapping. The US Virgin Islands have mapping. The French Antilles, Guadeloupe and Martinique, have mapping. The English-speaking Eastern Caribbean islands, Antigua, Dominica, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, Grenada, the Grenadines, Barbados, the small islands, have incomplete mapping. The mapping that does exist is in some cases lower resolution than would be useful for real-time evacuation planning. These are not scientific gaps. The science of inundation modelling is mature. It has been a workhorse of tsunami hazard analysis for decades, refined extensively after the Indian Ocean event, with software packages available for any qualified team to use. The gap is institutional. It is a question of which countries have allocated which budgets to which mapping efforts on which timelines. The English-speaking Eastern Caribbean has generally allocated less than the French and US territories. The maps are missing for reasons of resource allocation, not for reasons of scientific impossibility. Vertical evacuation infrastructure is the other gap, and it is essentially total. Across the entire Lesser Antilles arc, from Anguilla in the north to Grenada in the south, the number of purpose-built tsunami vertical evacuation structures is, by the best available accounting, 0. Some coastal hotels have reinforced upper floors that could function as informal vertical refugees in an event, but no structures have been designed, built and certified for that specific purpose. The contrast with Japan, where vertical evacuation infrastructure is built into the design of post-2011 coastal community planning, is sharp. The contrast even with the recently deployed Cascadia coast, where since the mid-2010s, a small but growing number of purpose-built vertical evacuation towers have been constructed in the most exposed Oregon and Washington coastal towns, is sharp. The connection back to the central narrative, The Lesser Antilles Megathrust is a fault system with a documented capacity to produce events at the scale of the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake. The regional warning system, designed to provide preparation and response capacity for such an event, is approximately 1 decade into its operational existence. The inundation maps that an evacuation would require are incomplete for the islands that would be most exposed. The vertical evacuation infrastructure that the geometric reality of the island's coastal plains would require, given the short warning intervals that local source tsunamis allow, does not exist. The system is, in every quantifiable measure, less prepared than its Pacific equivalents to handle the kind of event that its history has documented it can produce. This is not a story of malice or of suppression. The Caribbean Tsunami Warning System exists. It is staffed by competent professionals. It has been making steady progress for 2 decades. The institutional commitment is real. But the gap between what would be needed for an 1843 scale event today and what exists today is a gap that cannot be closed in months or in years. It would take decades, and the timing of the next major event is, as we have walked through, not within human capacity to predict. Part 13. What coupling actually means. Now we have to talk about the part of the science that the seismological community itself is most uncertain about, because it bears directly on whether anyone should be worried about this fault at all on any near-term timescale. The technical term is coupling, and what it refers to is the fraction of the plate interface that is currently locked, accumulating elastic strain, versus the fraction that is currently slipping smoothly and aseismically. A subduction zone where the interface is 100% coupled, fully locked, accumulates strain at the full rate of plate convergence. Every meter of plate motion shows up as a meter of stored slip deficit on the fault, waiting for the eventual rupture. A subduction zone where the interface is 0% coupled, fully slipping, accumulates no strain at all. The motion happens continuously and quietly, with no possibility of a large rupture because there is no stored strain to release. Real subduction zones are somewhere in between. Some have very high coupling: the central Chilean megathrust, the Sumatra megathrust, the Japan Trench north of the 2011 rupture, and produce large events on relatively short recurrence intervals. Some have very low coupling, parts of the Marianas Trench, parts of the Tonga Arc, and produce few large events. Most are in the middle. The Cascadia subduction zone has been a workhorse case study in coupling estimation. Modern estimates place the central Cascadia coupling fraction at approximately 70 to 80% over the central portion of the megathrust. For the Lesser Antilles arc, the coupling question has been studied for 2 decades, and the answers have not converged. The earliest serious modern attempt was published in 2006 by a team led by Luis Lopez, using the relatively sparse GPS receiver network on Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and a few other islands that was available at that time. The Lopez team's preferred model interpreted the GPS data as consistent with near-zero coupling on the northern segment of the Lesser Antilles megathrust, meaning, in the implications of the model, that the northern arc was sliding aseismically and would be unlikely to produce large megathrust events. This was, in the years immediately after publication, the dominant scientific view of the region. In 2008, a team led by Walter Manaka, working primarily at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, revisited the analysis. Manaka and his colleagues had access to a denser GPS network. Additional receivers had been deployed in the years since Lopez's analysis, and the longer time series allowed better separation of the steady-state deformation signal from the various transient noise sources. The Manaka model differed from Lopez's in an important conceptual respect. It explicitly accounted for the strain that was being absorbed by the Bunce Fault, a major strike-slip fault running approximately east-west along the northern boundary of the Caribbean plate. The Bunce Fault is taking up a significant fraction of the strike-slip component of the oblique plate convergence. When that fault's contribution is properly accounted for, the residual strain that has to be accumulated on the megathrust is smaller than Lopez's analysis implied, but it is not zero. The Manaka model's preferred coupling estimate for the northern Lesser Antilles megathrust was on the order of 20 to 30%, with substantial uncertainty. In 2015, a team led by Steve Simith, by then working at the Université d'État d'Haïti and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, published the most comprehensive analysis to date. The Simith team had more than a decade of additional GPS data beyond what Manaka's group had used, including data from new receivers deployed across the entire arc. The Simith model differentiated coupling along the arc rather than treating the entire system uniformly. The result was a coupling distribution that varied substantially with location. The central arc, Guadeloupe to Martinique, appeared to have moderately high coupling on the order of 30 to 50%. The northern leewards, where Saturday's earthquake occurred, appeared to have lower but still non-zero coupling on the order of 10 to 20%. These three studies, Lopez 2006, Manica 2008, Simith 2015, are not in agreement. They are in a kind of moderated disagreement, in which each subsequent study has used more data and somewhat different methods to refine the estimate, and the refinement has tended to move the coupling estimate upward over time. The current best published model, the Simith 2015 distribution, is the most widely cited, but it is not the last word. Subsequent unpublished work and conference presentations from the IPGP Antilles Deformation Group in Paris, working with the most recent GPS time series, have continued to argue about the partitioning. Some of the more recent presentations have suggested the coupling on parts of the arc may be higher still, closer to the central arc estimate of 40 to 50% than the 2015 Simith analysis indicated. Other workers continue to argue for lower numbers. The bottom line, stated carefully, is this. Every author who has carefully studied the question agrees that the Lesser Antilles megathrust is at least partly locked. No author can put a precise number on the locked fraction, with uncertainty narrower than approximately plus or minus 20%. The best available estimates place the locked fraction somewhere between 10% and 50%, depending on the segment of the arc you're talking about. The northern leewards, the segment that just produced Saturday's M6, is at the lower end of the published estimates, but the lower estimates from this segment may also be biased by the sparse network coverage that limits the analytical precision. What this means for the question of when the next major event might happen is straightforward and uncomfortable. If the coupling on the northern leewards is at the lower end of the published estimates, say 10 to 15%, then the segment is accumulating strain only slowly, the recurrence interval for a large event is correspondingly long, and the elapsed time since 1690 might still represent a small fraction of the average interval. If the coupling is at the higher end of the published estimates, say 20 to 30%, then the segment is accumulating strain faster, the recurrence interval is shorter, and the elapsed time since 1690 represents a significant fraction of the average interval. The honest answer to when might the next event happen depends critically on a number that the scientific community cannot currently estimate to better than a factor of 2 or 3. This is the science of uncertainty. It is not the same as we don't know anything. It is, we know enough to be sure the fault is real and at least partly loaded, and we know that we do not know enough to put a probability distribution on the next event with anything like the precision that the public conversation tends to assume. The conversation tends to want an answer that the science can't yet provide. The science is doing its job by refusing to provide an answer it can't defend. Part 14. 336 years. There is one more piece of the technical picture that has to be on the table before we close out the science section, and it is the piece called the seismic gap. The seismic gap concept is contested in seismology, and the contestation matters because it is the closest thing the field has to a next event predictor, and even at its most charitable, it is a weak predictor at best. The basic idea is that segments of a long plate boundary that have not produced large earthquakes in recent geological time are statistically more likely to produce the next large earthquake than segments that have recently ruptured. The logic, when it works, is that the strain on the unruptured segment has been accumulating for longer. If the segment has roughly the average loading rate for the boundary, then the segment that has been quiet for the longest is the segment closest to its next eventual rupture. The reason the concept is contested is that the empirical track record is mixed. Some plate boundaries, the southern Chile margin for example, have produced large events in patterns that broadly conform to the seismic gap prediction. Other boundaries, parts of the Tonga Arc, parts of the Aleutians, have produced large events in patterns that do not conform. The reasons for the inconsistency are partly geometric. Some segment boundaries are real geological features that constrain rupture propagation. Others are arbitrary divisions imposed by historians of the seismic record, and partly stochastic. Rupture initiation is a complex process that depends on local conditions, whose details we cannot directly measure. The contemporary view in seismology is that the seismic gap concept identifies regions of elevated long-term hazard, but does not, in any useful sense, predict the timing of specific events. For the Lesser Antilles arc, the seismic gap accounting goes like this. The southern arc, south of Martinique, has produced significant events in the past 2 centuries, with the 1953 Dominica earthquake and several other M6 to 7 events providing relatively recent strain release. The central arc, Guadeloupe to Dominica, has had the 1843 Guadeloupe event as its most recent significant rupture, 183 years ago. The Anegada passage segment had the 1867 event, 159 years ago. The northern leeward segment, Antigua, Barbuda, Anguilla, has not produced a confirmed magnitude 7.5 or greater event since 1690, 336 years. The longest documented gap on any segment of the Lesser Antilles arc system, in a region whose recurrence intervals appear to be on the order of 200 years. This does not, by itself, predict that the next event will occur in the northern leewards. The seismic gap argument is too weak for that kind of specific prediction, but it does identify the northern leewards as the segment that has been quiet the longest, which, combined with the geodetic evidence that some level of coupling is present there, and the historical evidence that the segment has produced large events in the past, places the segment in a hazard category that is, at minimum, not lower than the rest of the arc. And the segment is also, as we walked through earlier in this video, the one with the sparsest seismic monitoring network, the most uncertain depth determinations for individual events, the most uncertain coupling estimates, and the fewest of the public investment levers, building code retrofits, inundation mapping, vertical evacuation infrastructure, public awareness campaigns, that would reduce the impact of a future event if one were to occur. The combination is uncomfortable. The segment that has been quiet the longest, in the region with the most uncertainty about how loaded it is, in the locations with the most exposed populations and the least prepared infrastructure. None of this guarantees that an event will occur soon. It does mean that the segment is exactly where a responsible hazard analyst would look, first if asked which part of the arc most deserves additional attention from the institutions that could reduce its eventual consequences. That part of the arc is, on Saturday morning, where the M6 occurred. Part 15. 5 categories of claim. We need to spend some time on the field of claims that surrounded this event on social media in the hours after the rupture, because the same claims are going to surround any future Lesser Antilles event, and being able to walk into the next one with a calm framework for which claims hold water and which don't is part of what this video is for. The first category of claim was magnitude suppression. A range of voices argued in the immediate aftermath that the event was actually a magnitude 6.5 or 7.0 and had been downgraded to 6.0 to suppress public concern. This claim does not survive contact with the data. The US Geological Survey and the European Mediterranean Seismological Centre are independent agencies on different continents using different seismic station networks and different inversion software, and they converged on the same magnitude of 6.0 within standard reporting uncertainty. For the claim to be true, both agencies would need to be coordinating a deliberate fraud, a fraud that would have to be invisible to the dozens of independent academic seismology groups around the world that routinely cross-check public earthquake catalogues against their own analyses. The infrastructure for such a coordinated fraud does not exist. The simpler explanation, which is also the correct one, is that the magnitude is what the magnitude is. The second category of claim was that the tsunami warning had been withheld or suppressed. The actual tsunami warning bulletin issued by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration is in the public archive, time-stamped at 14:59 and 12 seconds Coordinated Universal Time, 9 minutes after the rupture began. The bulletin tone was advisory rather than evacuation directed because the event's combination of magnitude and depth did not, under standard protocols, warrant a higher alert classification. This was not a withholding of information. It was the routine application of the warning protocol which calibrates the alert level to the assessed threat. The warning was issued, was disseminated through the regional protocols, and was visible to any regional authority who was watching the standard channels. The fact that it did not lead to evacuation is because no evacuation was warranted for the event that actually occurred. The system worked as designed for the event that happened. Whether it would work as well for a much larger event is, as we have discussed, a separate and harder question. The third category of claim was that Caribbean earthquakes are accelerating. Various social media accounts cited Saturday's event together with a list of recent regional earthquakes: the 2010 Haiti event, the 2018 Anchorage event, the 2020 Puerto Rico swarm, the 2023 Jamaica area event, the 2024 Cayman Trough sequence, as evidence of a tectonic acceleration in the broader Caribbean region. The mathematics here do not support an acceleration. The Eastern Caribbean produces a steady background rate of magnitude 6 or greater events, on the order of 2 to 4 per decade in the modern instrumental record. The rate over the past 25 years is approximately consistent with the long-term average rate over the past century. What has changed is media attention and the visibility of every individual event through near-instant USGS catalogue dissemination and through social media amplification. Apparent acceleration is, in this case, most likely a reporting and attention effect rather than a tectonic one. Earthquakes that would have gone essentially uncommented in 1995 now generate dozens of articles, hundreds of tweets, and thousands of forum posts within hours of occurrence. The earthquakes themselves are not happening more frequently. The conversation about them is. The fourth category of claim was that HAARP or military activity or underwater testing had triggered the event. No physical mechanism connects any of these to plate interface or intraslab earthquakes. Ionospheric heating experiments deposit electromagnetic energy at altitudes of 80 to 300 kilometers above the Earth's surface, far above the depth at which earthquake nucleation occurs. Even at peak gigawatt-class operational power, the total deposited energy is many orders of magnitude smaller than the kinetic energy released in a moderate earthquake, and the energy that does get deposited is in the atmosphere, not in the lithosphere where the relevant strain is stored. Underwater military testing operations involve energy releases that are, while substantial, also many orders of magnitude smaller than the energy released in an M6 earthquake. The strain energy for a magnitude 6 event accumulates over years to decades through plate convergence. It is not deliverable by any technology that exists, and it has not been delivered to the May 16th event by any of the candidate mechanisms that occasionally circulate in these conversations. The fifth category of claim is the most sophisticated and partly defensible of the alternative framings. It is the overdue claim. The argument runs, the 1843 event killed 6,000 people. The elapsed time since 1843 is 183 years. The average recurrence interval for the central arc is on the order of 200 years. Therefore, the event is overdue. This argument is real, in the sense that the underlying numbers are real, but the framing is wrong. Overdue assumes that the recurrence interval is a regular periodic schedule that the system is obligated to honour. It does not. The recurrence interval is a statistical average of a quasi-periodic process with very long tails on both sides of the mean. A subduction zone with a 200-year mean recurrence has produced consecutive events 150 years apart, and consecutive events 400 years apart, and every spacing in between. The elapsed time since the last event is information about where in the distribution we sit, but it does not tell us where the next event will fall. Within the recurrence time uncertainty range is the technically correct framing. Overdue is a phrase that creates a false sense of imminent inevitability where none exists. The sixth and final category of claim, which is fair on its face, is the claim that no one is talking about this. That part is generally correct. The Eastern Caribbean Megathrust receives a tiny fraction of the public attention budget that goes to Cascadia or to the Japan Trench, despite a population exposure that is comparable and an evacuation infrastructure situation that is arguably worse. The undercoverage is real. The explanation is largely a function of media geography. English-language news organisations are concentrated in the United States and the United Kingdom, neither of which has its principal national interest directly in the Lesser Antilles, rather than any deliberate suppression. But the operational consequence is the same. The system is undercovered, the public is uninformed, and the institutional resources that follow public attention are correspondingly underallocated. The honest framing, which is the one this video has been trying to hold the whole way through, is that the data are alarming enough on their own. No conspiracy is needed to explain why this system is dangerous. The conspiracy frames distract from the actual story, which is the documented record, the published science, and the institutional gaps. Those by themselves are enough to warrant the attention that this video is trying to give. Part 16. What you have now been told. Let me bring all of this back together one more time, in the proportion in which it sits in honest perspective, before we close out tonight. What happened on Saturday morning was, in absolute terms, small. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake at moderate depth, offshore from the island of Barbuda, in the eastern Caribbean. It was felt across the Leeward Islands. It caused no significant damage. It killed nobody. It generated no tsunami. It triggered a 9-minute advisory bulletin from the regional tsunami warning system, which was allowed to expire without escalation. By every honest measure, it was a routine event for the region. What that routine event happened on top of is, in proportional perspective, not small at all. The Lesser Antilles Megathrust is a real, mapped, monitored, mostly ignored feature of North American seismic hazard. The fault is one of the principal plate boundaries on the planet. The fault has, in February of 1843, produced a rupture that killed somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 people in the town of Pointe-à-Pitre, alone in a single morning, by a combination of structural collapse and post-earthquake fire. The fault has, in November of 1867, in combination with the adjacent Anegada Passage transition zone, produced a rupture that generated local tsunami of 6 to 7 meters at the town of Frederiksted on St. Croix, killing approximately 30 people and famously carrying the USS Monongahela inland by several hundred feet. The same Lesser Antilles arc system has in 1755 been struck by a transoceanic tsunami from a magnitude 9 class earthquake in Iberia, with documented wave heights of 3 to 7 meters at several of the islands. The same arc system has, on May the 8th, 1902, produced what is now classified as the deadliest volcanic eruption of the 20th century, with the destruction of the town of Saint-Pierre on Martinique and the deaths of 28,000 to 30,000 people in approximately 1 minute. The same arc system hosts on its southern flank the only active submarine volcano in the Caribbean basin, Kikum-Jenny, whose past mass-wasting history includes flank collapse events that, if repeated today, could generate tsunamis of 10 to 30 meters at the nearest islands within minutes. The exposure footprint of this system today is 6 to 7 million permanent residents. The transient population during peak tourism months is another several hundred thousand to perhaps 1 million visitors on any given day. The basin-wide exposure to a worst-case event is approximately 35 million. The earthquake-resistant building stock across the smaller islands is largely older than the modern seismic codes. The vertical evacuation infrastructure is essentially non-existent. The tsunami inundation mapping is incomplete for the English-speaking Eastern Caribbean. The regional warning system is a decade into its operational existence and has not been tested by an event at the scale the historical record indicates the system can produce. The science of how loaded the fault currently is has converged on a careful, honest answer. We know enough to be sure the interface is at least partly locked, somewhere between 10 and 50% depending on the segment of the arc, and the segment where Saturday's M6 occurred has been quiet for 336 years, the longest documented gap on any segment of the arc. We know enough to be confident that the system is capable of producing a magnitude 8 or larger rupture in the relatively foreseeable future, in the sense of decades to centuries. We do not know, and probably will never know, the year or even the decade. The recurrence interval is not a calendar, so why is this system absent from the conversation? Cascadia gets documentaries, the San Andreas gets blockbuster movies. The Japan Trench has, after 2011, acquired a permanent place in global consciousness, with the imagery of the Tohoku tsunami inundating the Sendai coastline now part of the standard visual vocabulary of the modern world. The Lesser Antilles Megathrust does not exist in any of those registers. There are no major documentaries, there are no major motion pictures, there is no acquired vocabulary in the public mind, there is no constant low-grade cultural awareness of the hazard. The system, in every cultural register that matters, has been forgotten. That forgetting is not malicious. It is, in the way that almost all civilizational forgetting works, the cumulative product of small decisions made by many people over many decades, in which each individual decision was reasonable, and the aggregate consequence is that an entire 7 million person exposure footprint has been left without the cultural infrastructure that would, in a different and more attentive world surround it. The mainstream English-language news organisations did not cover the 1843 Guadeloupe earthquake at the time, because Pointe-à-Pitre was a French colonial port, and the English-language press of the early Victorian era was not paying attention to French Caribbean disasters. The mid-20th century institutionalisation of earthquake awareness happened around the events that the United States and Japan experienced: the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the 1923 Kanto earthquake, the 1960 Chilean earthquake, the 1964 Alaska earthquake. The 1843 Guadeloupe event was, by then, a century in the past, in a French overseas territory, with no living survivors and limited photographic record. It dropped, slowly and quietly, out of public memory. The result is what you have today: a fault that has killed 6,000 people in one morning, in living historical time, that almost no one has heard of. A system whose exposure footprint is the population of a major American city, whose historical record is a sequence of catastrophes, and whose institutional preparation for the next event is 2 decades into a process that the Pacific has had 3/4 of a century to develop. On Saturday morning, it produced a small reminder that it is still there. The question this video should leave you with is not whether the big one is coming. The big one is coming, in some sense, eventually. We do not get to know when. The geology will decide on its own schedule, and the schedule is not on anything that human civilization can affect or predict. The question is how the 7 million people in the exposure footprint and the 20 million in the broader basin-wide exposure, and the institutions that nominally represent their interests in the construction of warning systems and evacuation, infrastructure, and building codes and inundation maps, how those people, and those institutions, and the broader cultural awareness that should be surrounding them, are going to use the time between now and whenever the next major event arrives. That time might be tomorrow. It might be a century. The arithmetic of preparation does not change either way. Every year that passes without an event is a year in which the infrastructure could have been built. Every year that passes with the infrastructure unbuilt is a year in which the exposure to the eventual event is larger, not smaller. The fault is what it is. The history is what it is. The science is what it is. The exposure is what it is. The institutions are what they are. What we do with the noticing, that is, in the end, the only variable that any of us can affect. And we are, right now, doing very little with it. That is, in the most honest framing this video can offer, what you should have been told about the magnitude 6.0 that just hit the Caribbean, you have now been told. What happens next is no longer a function of what you know. It is a function of what you and the rest of us together choose to do about it.